Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second plenary session of the iEA. And as you all know, the title of the session is Economics and Psychology, Fishing for Fools Revisited. Now, Fishing for Fools is, of course, the title of, one part of the title of a book published by Professor Akerlof and Robert Schiller. I was trying to find a clever way of describing the book, but of course I couldn't. So I borrowed from Kaushik Basu's review of the book, in which he describes it as a rare economics book, a fast-paced monograph of fables, at the end of which many a mainstream economist will end up questioning some of her own long-standing beliefs and presumptions. So if there's anything that's going to wake you up in Mexico, I think it's going to be Professor George Akerlof's presentation. He really needs no introduction, but perhaps just a few words. He was the joint recipient of the 2001 Nobel Prize for Economic Sciences with Joe Stiglitz and Mike Spence, which means that the iEA now has 2/3 of the class of 2001 in its midst. So we're very honored to have Professor Akerlof here as well. And as I was telling George earlier, the paper Market for Lemons is, of course, the paper that received the prominence in the Nobel Prize Award. And it's a paper I still turn to, having read it as an undergraduate student. He's currently at Georgetown University, but I think it would be remiss not to mention that he spent over 40 years at UC Berkeley. So please join me in welcoming Professor Akerlof.
Thank you, Haroon, very much, and thank you, everybody who's coming to this talk. So Bob Schiller and I, we published a book 21 months ago, and it's called Fishing for Fools. It could be that the best thing about the book is the cover, which you now see, which was done by Ed Koren. He's the cartoonist who does fuzzy animals. And so he did this cover for us. Well, let me give some prefatory notes. The first and most fundamental motivation of the book. Can you hear? Okay. The first and most fundamental motivation of the book is to challenge the view of the public and of economists that whatever markets do is right. Such belief that whatever markets do is right has a further problem. It is enshrined a morality that greed is healthy, in the words of Ivan Boesky. Of course, all of us would take into account income distribution and such things as pollution, but that does not exhaust the reasons why competitive markets yield bad outcomes. The role of this book is therefore to undermine the fundamental basis of free-to-choose thinking by showing that there's not only a good side to free markets, but there's also a very serious downside. Now, the book explores the notion that markets are the playing field for deception and manipulation. Why? Because they spawn what we call fishing for fools. Now, all economists know this. Everybody here in this audience knows this. But that leads to the second very general motivation. The rule of what can and cannot be published in economics leaves holes. There are some perfectly valid and important things to say, but there's no way to say them that would be acceptable in any journal. For example, quite a few economists thought that financial derivatives would lead to the current crisis. But economists could not figure out a way to express these views in the form of a paper. So I believe that Fishing for Fools is one of those holes in economics. Because we all know it cannot be published. But then, because it cannot be published in journal form, it then gets ignored. And because it was ignored, we had the financial crisis, which is a central event in the economic history of our times. But then the book also has a subtext. There's a subtext which gradually becomes increasingly important as the book proceeds. That subtext concerns a principle in which we think, and that results in our being fished for fools. So I'm going to come to that later. Okay, so let me begin. So with these prefatory notes, let me begin with the theory. The book is based on conversations with the psychologist Danny Kahneman some 30 years ago. In a conversation then, Danny told me that the basis for psychology was that humans are machines. We're machines that are prone to error. And the job of the psychologist then is to ferret out that error. In contrast, he said, the basic fundamental notion of economics is equilibrium. That equilibrium means that if there's a profit left on the table, someone will take up that opportunity for profit. So we see that every time we go to the supermarket. People sequentially choose what they think is the shortest line, and then in equilibrium, the lines are almost the same length. So how to put Danny's insight into economics? Danny's insight says that free markets will not just provide what we really want. That's only the case if we human machines are making the right choices. But free markets will also provide us with the wrong choices, and they will do so as long as there's a profit to be made. So let me restate. The principle means that if we have some weakness or other, in the equilibrium, that weakness will be taken up if there's a profit to be made. So what does that mean? That means that among business persons looking around and deciding where to spend their investment dollars, some will look to see if there are unusual profits from our weaknesses. And if they see such an opportunity for profit, that will be what they choose. As a result, economists will have a fishing equilibrium. That's an equilibrium in which every chance for profit more than the ordinary will be taken up, and that includes our willingness to make the wrong choices. Okay, so let me give two examples. So example one is Cinnabon. Okay, the motto of Cinnabon is life needs frosting. Okay, and there's a Cinnabon. So most Americans take it for granted. They take it for granted that there happens to be such an outlet right where we are waiting for our delayed flight or at the mall. All those outlets and all that cinnamon, which undermines our diets, they're a natural result of a free market equilibrium. So let me give you a second example. The second example comes from a metaphor. This metaphor was invented by Bob. So Bob's a true genius. I could have never thought of this, but Bob developed this. Okay. So Keith Chen, Venkat Lakshminarayanan, and Laurie Santos taught Capuchin monkeys how to use money to trade. The monkeys developed an appreciation of price. They saved and they did other transactions. But let's go beyond those experiments. Okay? So let's do a thought experiment. Suppose we open the monkeys up to trading with humans quite generally. We would give a large population of Capuchins substantial incomes and let them be customers of for-profit businesses run by humans without regulatory safeguard. Well, you can easily imagine that the free market system, with its taste for profits, would supply whatever the monkeys choose to buy. We would expect an economic equilibrium with concoctions appealing to strange Capuchin tastes. But amid this monkey cornucopia, their choices would be very different from what makes them happy. Why do we know? Because we know from Chen, Lakshminarayanan, and Santos that they love fruit roll-up tacos with marshmallow fluff. So Capuchins have limited ability to resist temptations, and we have every expectation that they would become anxious, malnourished, exhausted, addicted, quarrelsome, and sickened. So we now come to the point of this thought experiment. We see what it has to say about humans. Our view of the monkeys has analyzed their behavior as if they have two types of what economists call tastes. The first type of tastes are what the Capuchins would exercise if they made the decisions that are good for them. The second type of taste, their fruit roll-up taco tastes, are what they actually exercise. So humans are no doubt smarter than monkeys, but we can view our behavior in the same terms. We can imagine us humans, like the Capuchins, as also having two different types of taste. The first concept of taste describes what is really good for us, but as in the case of the Capuchins, that's not always the basis for all of our decisions. The second type of taste is the taste that determines how we really make our choices. And those choices may not, in fact, be good for us. Yeah. Okay, let me just see that I'm on the right page. I think so. The distinction between the two types of taste in the example of the Capuchins gives us an image. We can think about our economy as if we all have monkeys on our shoulders when we go shopping or when we make economic decisions. Those monkeys on our shoulders are in the form of the weaknesses that have been exploited by marketers for ages. Because of those weaknesses, many of our choices differ from what we really want, or alternatively stated, they differ from what is good for us. So we're not generally aware of that monkey on our shoulder. So in the absence of some curbs on markets, we reach an economic equilibrium where the monkeys on the shoulder are substantially calling the shots. So that takes us to a further proposition. Okay. The modern rendition of Adam Smith's invisible hand statement is that the competitive free market equilibrium is Pareto optimal. What does that mean? That means that once such an economy is in equilibrium, it's impossible to improve the economic welfare of everyone. For example, a change that would cause Carla's welfare to go up would cause my welfare or someone else's, perhaps yours, to go down. Any interference will make someone worse off. The theory, of course, recognizes some factors, we all know them, that might blemish such an equilibrium of competitive free markets, such as problems of pollution and bad distributions of income. But with those qualifications, the result is believed by economists to be true. But then, with completely free markets, there's not only freedom to choose, there's also freedom to fish. It will still be true that the equilibrium will be Pareto optimal, but will be an equilibrium that's optimal not in terms of what we really want. It will be an equilibrium that's optimal instead in terms of our monkey on the shoulder taste. And that, for the monkeys, as for ourselves, will lead to manifold problems. Now, I know what everybody's thinking, because this is what I've always thought myself. Standard economics has ignored this obvious difference because most economists have thought that for the most part, people do know what they want. That means that there's nothing much to be gained from examining the differences between what we really want and what those monkeys on our shoulders are instead telling us. But that ignores the field of psychology. Psychology is, for the most part, about the effects of those monkeys. It also ignores the fact that competitive equilibrium will also involve people generating information that will lead us astray insofar it is legal and insofar as there is profit to be made for it. It ignores that markets enable fishing for fools. So, at this point, the onus is on us. The onus on Bob and myself in the book is then to indicate that in real life, this equilibrium does affect our lives. So, we have 4 areas of nobody could possibly wants in which we're seriously fish for fools. Okay? So here are the 4 areas. Area 1 of no one could possibly want is personal financial insecurity. Fundamental fact of economic life has never made it into the economics textbooks. Most adults, even in rich countries, go to bed at night worried about how to pay the bills. Economists think that it's easy for people to spend according to budget. We shall see later, in just a few minutes, that it isn't. No one wants to go to bed at night worried about the bills. Yet most people do. Area 2 of nobody could possibly want is financial and macroeconomic instability. So fishing for fools in financial markets is the leading cause of the financial crises that lead to the deepest recessions. Every time it is different, the stories are different, the entrepreneurs are different, their offerings are different, but also every time it is the same. There are the fishermen, and then there are the fools. And when the built-up stock of undiscovered fishes, named the bezel by John Kenneth Galbraith, gets discovered, then what happens is asset prices crash. And then when they crash, we get into some kind of recession. In the last crisis, the investment managers who had purchased the overrated securities could not have possibly wanted them. Okay. So area 3 of nobody could possibly want is ill health, number 3 on the list. Here we discussed how the pharmaceuticals do their fishing and how the food industry, with a PH, fills us with sugar, salt, and fat. In his 5-year career, Vioxx is estimated to have caused 26,000 to 56,000 cardiovascular deaths in the United States. No one wants bad medicine. About 69% of American adults are overweight. More than 35% of American adults are obese. Yet nobody wants to be obese. And then there's tobacco. Area 4 of nobody could possibly want is bad government. Just as free markets work at least tolerably well under ideal conditions, so does democracy. And politics is then vulnerable to the simplest fish, whereby politicians silently gather money from the interests and use that money to show that they're just one of the folks back home. So a chapter of the book describes a campaign by Charles Grassley of Iowa, who gathered a multi-million-dollar war chest, and then he showered the state with TV ads where he's just one of us back home in Iowa, riding his tractor lawnmower in concentric ellipses. It's a truly beautiful ad. I mean, anyone who appreciates color will just love it, because he's riding this tractor lawnmower around in ellipses, and there's this beautiful Iowa green grass, and then in the background there's a barn of the exactly same tone of red. And so it's just a beautiful thing. And he's saying, you know, I like my job in Washington, but what I really like to do is just come home and mow my lawn, just like you. Okay, vote Grassley. You got Grassley. You got the joke. So almost no one wants a democracy where elections are fought in this way. Okay, so now we get the next. Okay. So now let me give you the taste of one chapter, but then we're going to also get into the major message of the book, a second major message. Probably most of you, I'm not sure how many of you know Susie Orman, who's a popular US TV figure. So she gives, as you can see, very loud and shrill financial advice. Her audience seemed to adore her and lap up her every word. When I asked an IMF economist friend of mine about her, he had the predictable reaction. He had watched her for only 10 seconds. He could not stand her mommy knows best voice, and he found her investment advice simplistic. But that doesn't explain a puzzle. It does not explain why Orman's audiences lap her up. Orman's most popular book is The 9 Steps to Financial Freedom, practical and spiritual steps so you can stop worrying. So let's contrast what Susie Orman tells us there with the portrait given of consumer spending in the economics textbooks. So, according to economics textbooks, we decide on our demand for the proverbial apples and oranges by choosing the bundle of apples and oranges that maximizes our happiness, subject to our budget constraint. But Susie Orman's financial advice books tells us the consumers do not follow such a textbook protocol in their purchases. Well, how could consumers do anything other than what the textbooks describe? So I'm an economist, that I think I do exactly what the textbooks describe. But Orman tells us that people have emotional hang-ups with regard to money and with regard to spending. So they're not honest with themselves. And as a consequence, they do not engage in rational budgeting. So how could she know? Well, she's a financial advisor, and she has a test. She asked her advisees to add up their expenditures, and those expenditures all but invariably fall short of what a documented accounting from the records later turns up. Figuratively, relative to the proverbial trip to the supermarket to buy apples and oranges, it's as if her advisees spend too much in the fruit section, and by the time they reach dairy products, there's nothing left over for eggs and milk. In real life, such budgetary failure translates into having nothing left over for savings. So this failure to deal cognitively and emotionally with money, says Orman, leads to those unpaid bills. It's her mission to keep those bills down so that her readers and her clients will no longer worry at night. So that's the role of mommy, and it's also the reason why those audiences are excusing that mommy knows best voice. So it's worth noting, more than parenthetically, that worries, as noted in Orman's subtitle, are central concerns of financial advice books, but you do not find them in books on economics. So we can paint a statistical portrait which shows that this is a serious concern. So this poses a problem. This Susie Orman view of the world suggests that people are spending too much, and they were worried as a result. So that leads to the question, why? And this takes us to the second general message from Fishing for Fools. Current behavioral economics is based on economics and psychology. But there's another emerging branch of economics. This is based on sociology rather than on psychology. Why would sociology make a difference? So we've already seen, the textbooks tell us that we should describe our behavior in the supermarket as maximizing our utility subject to a budget constraint. We all know that. That's what determines our demand for apples and oranges. According to textbooks, that's the story we're telling ourselves. The textbooks also indicates that we should use a similar story to derive most of economics. Perhaps surprisingly, such derivation fails to describe much of real life. So the question arises, what is the mistake in the model? A basic mistake is that our economic models rein in from 30,000 feet on people on the ground, our little people on the ground, our assumptions regarding what they care about and then correspondingly how they behave. People may be very purposeful, as economists presume. That means we're maximizing something. But how people behave is determined by how they think. And a good way to picture how people think, and probably how you think, and what determines how people behave, is that in every moment of our lives, we're living out some story. Okay? The decisions that we make depend upon the stories that are the focus when we make those decisions. While the first part of the book refers to conventional behavioral economics regarding why people may be fooled, with a PH, the second part of the book emphasizes this much more general point. That point is that we're fooled because we're always telling ourselves stories. That corresponds to the core of both sociology and cultural anthropology. That core is ethnographies that uncover those stories that people are telling themselves. It also, when you think about it, it reflects what advertisers do. So what do advertisers do? Their mission, the mission of the advertiser, is to graft onto the story that we're already telling ourselves another story that will get us to buy their product. So in order to make our economics right, we need to base motivation on those stories that people are telling themselves. So before I go further, let me give an indication for the ubiquity of stories, the ubiquity of stories in any capitalist economy. So you see it on any commercial street in any town. So the shop windows there induce you to tell yourself a story that gets you to come in and buy. So I'll tell you such a story. So in the US, in the old days, when I was younger, on shopping streets in suburban areas, there used to be pet stores that placed puppies in the window. Okay? And there's an old song. Okay? Patty Page, the singer, is coming down the street. And she sees such a puppy, and she sings. So I hope you don't mind if I'm going to sing, okay? So I'll just sing you one verse. How much is that doggy in the window? The one with the waggly tail. How much is that doggy in the window? I do hope that doggy is for sale. Arf, arf. Okay. So, thank you very much. Okay. Now, the fact is, there are probably some people here in the audience who know that first verse, but very few, almost nobody knows what comes next. And this is what it says. Okay? I must take a trip to California. and leave my poor sweetheart alone. If he has a dog, he won't be lonesome, and the doggy will have a good home. So I don't know if it's intentional or not, but this song has a beautiful ambiguity which exactly mirrors Fishing for Fools. On the one hand, the girl's purchase may be marvelously considerate. Her relationship with her boyfriend may be perfect. And every time the doggy wags its tail, the boyfriend will be reminded of their beautiful romance. Okay? On the other hand, the relationship may be a disaster. The girl may be totally scatterbrained. Every time the doggy needs to be walked, the boyfriend will have to take care of it, and he will also be reminded of the failed relationship. So life in a capitalist economy is therefore not just an opportunity to get what you want. It is also about the creation and spread of stories that influence you to come in and buy. Those stories are to get you to buy, irrespective of whether the purchase is good for you or not. So the rest of my talk then will be 4 stories that indicate their central role in economics and politics. Okay, so I'm going to give you the first story. So how did the Europeans get themselves into the euro? So there's a new book coming out by Ashok Modi, and it will probably have the title Euro Tragedy. There was a story that the Europeans' desire for unity would allow them to easily overcome the problems of a fixed exchange rate across most of Europe. Helmut Kohl had told a similar story in Germany in the late 1980s and early 1990s regarding the currency union of East and West Germany at a 1-to-1 ratio between Eastmarks and Deutschmarks. And then Kohl became a leading supporter of the euro. The integration of the East and West German economies had been difficult enough. But with the euro, no single language would ease migration as had occurred between the 2 Germanys, nor would there be huge fiscal transfers from richer countries to poorer countries to ease the problems. Economists' analysis that a single currency would prevent needed exchange rate adjustments went unheeded. The story of the benefits from the euro gained traction. So Modi tells how the myth of the benefits of the euro escaped like a virus from official meetings. Part of that story was magical thinking, that the problems of fixed exchange rate would be magically solved with the wave of a desire for unity wand. The story itself has played a crucial role in the economic state of Europe today. Let me give you another example in which a story made a huge difference. This story is from a paper by Dennis Snower and myself, entitled Bread and Bullets. It begins with a joke from communist Russia. So a man walks into a grocery store with a notebook. Do you have sausage? Nope. Nope. He makes a note. Bread? Nope. He makes another note. 20 years ago, they would have shot you for making notes like that, says a woman waiting in line. No bullets either, he writes. So the joke illustrates the Soviet system at every scale. Our article demonstrates the role of the Bolshevik story under the communists. According to that story, the Bolshevik plan for force-fed industrialization would create a new paradise on Earth. This story legitimated extreme cruelty against anyone accused of resisting the plan. But even worse, ruthless men like Stalin falsely accused their opponents of resistance to the plan. And then they used the sanctions legitimated by the Bolshevik story to eliminate those opponents. So let's turn to another story. This time, unfortunately, we economists did not do so well. Okay, so financial derivatives. Okay? According to standard economic theory, in the absence of externalities, the equilibrium of free market competitive economy will be Pareto optimal. The 1990s, financial derivatives of many complicated types were introduced, and they grew wildly. But economists offered no warnings. Economists told the story that the new securities would be benign, the new securities would help people hedge against risk. But on this reasoning, the United States Commodities Futures Modernization Act of 2000 greatly restricted the regulation of financial derivatives. The story behind this regulation failed to see that financial markets serve 2 functions. They match savers with investor, and that's good. But financial markets are also a gambling casino, and thus also a place in which to bilk the unwary, and that's bad. So the spread of these derivatives has greatly increased the fragility of financial markets. The securities can be designed to dupe people into taking risks they had never intended, and then people go bust. The markets for derivatives have been a playing field to fish people for fools, which resulted in the worldwide financial crisis of 2008. They have permanently made world financial markets more fragile. The description of how this happened is then the subject of 3 chapters in Fishing for Fools. So let me give you another story about global warming. The first inconvenient truth of global warming is the physical problem of climate change itself. But there's a second inconvenient truth. That is the story the public tells itself. At the extreme, that story says global warming is a hoax. Yet more prevalent is failure to perceive the urgency of counteracting it. So year after year after year slips by, and this threat gets ever worse. Okay, so let me come to summary and conclusion. The book, Fishing for Fools, then gives us 2 major points. The Pareto optimality of competitive free markets is not the Pareto optimality of our what's good for you tastes. It's the Pareto optimality of our monkey on the shoulder tastes. That means that if you have some weakness from which someone can make a profit, that someone somewhere will find it profitable to set up a business to take advantage of your weakness. That's what happens in a fishing equilibrium. So then, Fishing for Fools gives example after example after example of this principle. Fishing for Fools also teaches us that the world's problems are not just the fundamental physics problems like global warming itself, they also include the stories that people tell themselves that get us into those physical problems. Such stories also keep us from dealing with those problems effectively when they arise. So those stories and how they arise, they should be a part of our economics itself. So as illustrations of the role of those stories, we saw the euro, we saw communism, we saw financial derivatives, we saw global warming, and we also saw the dog eat. So counteracting stories that lead to bad outcomes needs to be a major function of economic policy in every country at every level worldwide. And of course, talking to all of you here, that's also the job of each and every one of us as economists. So one of our major roles is to counteract the stories that people would otherwise be telling themselves that would get themselves into a lot of trouble. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Now I know how my children got me to buy that doggy in the window. Our discussant will be Carla Hoff, who is a lead economist at the World Bank. I think best known in this particular context for being the co-director of the WDR of 2015, which was titled Mind, Society and Behavior, and lots of fascinating examples equivalent to George's in that WDR. But she's published very widely in the AUR and beyond, and has a PhD from Princeton. So, Carla, over to you. Thanks.
It's a pleasure to follow such an entertaining talk. This is a canonical picture of the kind of more psychologically realistic way of decision-making that has motivated George Akerlof's book, and in fact, much of his work throughout his career. I thought I'd use a cartoon to capture the main themes of his book. This is a rational actor who is the hero of standard economics. He's on page 1, he's on the last page of every book in standard economics. In fact, in essentially every book in economics until the behavioral revolution, which began only in the 1980s. The rational actor is like the control tower. He has fixed preferences. Those preferences are autonomous. Economists don't worry about where they come from, and they certainly think the economic outcomes do not affect those preferences. If you prefer Coke to water, you prefer Coke to water. It has nothing to do with the environment in which you're in. And standard economics summarizes that in the famous theorems of Ehrer and de Breuer, the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, which says that the market always leads to the best possible outcome. The only way to make any one person better off is to hurt somebody else. And Fishing for Fools summarizes that. It's so small there. Just let everyone be free to choose, says the mantra, and we will have an earthly paradise. So you see, you can learn standard economics and why it's wrong later by reading Fishing for Fools. But behavioral economics brings in psychology, as George says. And the metaphor, the very fun metaphor that George credits Bob with inventing, is the monkey on our shoulders. So here's a monkey, and among other things, the monkey likes instant gratification. And this is a picture of how people can deal with their impulses for instant gratification. They can put temptation goods into locked vessels which only unlock at predetermined times. So they can commit that they will not eat the M&Ms until such and such a time, or the cookies, or use their phone, or pay for their credit card. But in real life, we are susceptible to many things that we cannot make pre-commitments about. As Fishing for Fools emphasizes, the profit maximizing pressures on firms lead them to constantly invent new ways to deceive you. Nobody predicted the 2008 financial crisis. We couldn't put our assets into locked boxes, and so the fishes may take over. And this is a cartoon that represents the monkey on our shoulders. So small. Oh, that's true. Thank you. Thank you. Now, psychology has advanced very much in the last couple of decades. When Kahneman really stopped developing new ideas and Tversky was gone. The human mind is a pattern matching machine, is the view that's now largely taken in psychology. And we have new fields, cultural psychology and cognitive sociology. There are patterns in the outside world, and they enter into our minds in the form of cultural mental models, sometimes called schemas. And whenever we're in any situation, we immediately try to figure out what pattern it matches, and then we'll focus on those things that are salient to us given those patterns, and we might ignore things that don't fit the patterns, and we might even make up things that the pattern has, even though the situation doesn't have them. So we'll get things systematically wrong, but not in a universal way, in a culturally specific way, because different cultures are exposed to different patterns. The narrative is one kind of pattern, and of course Fishing for Fools gives wonderful examples of how narratives can fool you. And in George's conclusion today, he argued that one of the things that should be central in economics is correcting misleading narratives. I'd like to argue that that view could be broadened just a little bit to recognize the production of narratives and the usefulness of narratives in many cases. This is, of course, not at all to argue with George's point or the lovely story of the puppy in the window, but just to say that markets can actually produce pro-welfare narratives. And I'm going to give you two examples. This is a picture of call center girls, a booming industry in India, and Rob Jensen did a randomized controlled trial. He took 160 villages that had never been a site for recruiting call center girls. He divided them in half, and to 60 of those 180 villages, he sent these call center recruiters a couple of days a year for 3 years. They gave all the women their phone numbers. The women were free to call whenever they wanted help, advice on how to get a call center job. There were 11 job matches on average per village over 3 years. You know, very few girls had the education to do these jobs. But the number of girls with these jobs went up from 0% to 5.6%. That created a new story where girls were people too. Girls could have jobs too. Girls could be important too. It changed the way parents treated their girls. It changed the way girls viewed their own lives. It changed the proportion who got married, the proportion who had children very early in life, and most strikingly, it changed the body mass index, the BMI of girls. The treatment closed 30% of the gap between village girls and the wealthiest girls in Delhi. The parents saw their little girls differently and fed them better and cared for them better. Now, of course, someone who really was wanting to defend the standard economic model could say the parents now perceived that the girls could become productive in call center jobs as adults. But with a jump from 0 to 5 percentage points, Jensen argues that that's probably not the complete story, that the story entails a new narrative. Market outcomes, in this view, affect who we are. If we see that girls can have jobs, we look at them differently. If we see that blacks can be president, we look at them differently. Fictional narratives are entering our brain just like non-fictional ones. You process fiction and non-fiction in exactly the same way. Markets can actually produce wonderfully pro-development narratives. A company called Globo has a monopoly on soap operas in Brazil. At 9 o'clock in the evening, apparently 2/3 of Brazilians are in front of their TV watching soap operas. The company featured only soap operas with very small families. The women either had no children or just one child. We can identify causally the effect of the emissions because they were available at different times in different municipalities. La Ferrara et al., in a very recent paper, shows that the year after a municipality had access to the Globo emissions, the fertility rate dropped, and it stayed dropped. It had especially a big impact on those with low education who couldn't read, who had never been exposed to social patterns where women didn't get married young and have children 9 months after marriage and then keep having children on and on for many years. So the key 1990s view about cognition that emerged after Kahneman and Tversky's work is really that minds should not be viewed as machines. We have cognitive structures that are cultural, that shape how we think. And these shared social constructs are not in conscious control. We don't choose them. There's nothing optimal about the narratives in your head. You don't get to throw out a narrative or add a new narrative just because it's optimal. You have some influence over it, but many of the narratives, many of the concepts that shape your thinking, you're not even consciously aware of. So let me summarize. What we learn in standard economics is that the decision maker is a rational actor. And if we want to influence him, we have to give him information or change his incentives. Kahneman and Tversky introduced what Dick Thaler has called the quasi-rational actor. He can be inconsistent. He joins a gym, he pays money for the gym, but on entering the gym, he rides up on the escalator. And after that, he sits on a bike and he works really hard and the bike doesn't advance. So it's a really nonsensical kind of individual that is pictured in the first photo I showed you. The quasi-rational actor is motivated not just by incentives, but also by context. But there's a third kind of actor that work in sociology and the new fields of cultural psychology emphasizes. So in a recent paper with Joe Stiglitz, who seems to be the author of many papers presented here, so I thought I'd throw him in, we argue that there's really two strands of behavioral economics. Behavioral economics is simply defined as economics with a psychologically more realistic notion of the decision maker. We argue that strand two is about how what George has been telling you are the second kind of decisions you make, not the ones the monkey made, but the ones that are about what's good for you. Those actually should be viewed as culturally based, that what you think is good for you will be different in a patriarchal society, in a racist society, than they will be in a society that gives women a chance, or that gives blacks a chance, or that gives Muslims a chance. We have not only endogenous preferences. Do we want to educate our girl? Do we want to feed our girl? But endogenous ways of thinking. How do we respond when someone says something that could be interpreted as insulting? Do we hit him, or do we try to figure out what's the possible misunderstanding? In some countries, you have to hit him and ask questions later. We have even endogenous perception. Wonderful work by psychology shows that if you look at people who live north of the Yangtze River in China, and thus historically have a wheat culture, and south of the Yangtze River, and thus historically have a rice culture, they actually focus their eyes differently. You give them pictures of an aquarium, they see different things. So we're also guided very much, not just by incentives and not just by context, but by the experience and exposure that our cultural group has had that shapes the narratives and the concepts with which we think. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carla. So we actually do have quite a bit of time, thanks to the timekeeping of the speakers. So I guess what we'll do is take rounds of 3 questions, perhaps in batches. So the floor is yours. Please introduce yourself when you ask the question. There's a mic coming.
Hi, I'm Karna Basu from Hunter College. I have a question for George. I thought your point about stories and stories designed to manipulate us into wanting certain things, I thought that was very compelling. What I don't quite understand, I think it's true, but what I don't quite understand is why there isn't more competition in stories. What about the bank that should set up next to the pet store, recognize that people are going to use all their money on the pet store? Why don't they tell a counter narrative about how all the perils of having a pet that could actually ring more true?
Okay, so I've always felt that this is a question of good stories versus bad stories. There are, so insofar as there's the pet store, there are all the other stores that you passed as you go down the street. Can you hear? So yeah, okay. So it seems to me that what this opens up is exactly what you've mentioned, that there is competition between stories. And of course, that's what we find a great deal of life is all about. That's what I think when we're talking about bringing these stories in, which is the central theme in sociology and anthropology, that then in fact we have a whole much richer economics. So just tell the story of the Bolshevik Revolution, and then you've got that story. The history of that is about the stories that were competing with each other at the time of the takeover. Can I make one more comment? Am I allowed to make another comment? Okay, so one of the things that I learned from this book, my first job was at Berkeley in 1966, and the department was dominated by Gerard Debreu and Roy Radner. And they were very big into general equilibrium theory. So, you know, I never had a huge amount of respect for general equilibrium theory. But having written this book, I have a huge amount of respect for general equilibrium theory. And so my thought is, with this book, is if there's someone anywhere in the whole world under the global economy, if they want to come and sell you a Cinnabon and they can make a profit, they're going to do that. Now, here we are. We're the target of all those people who, if they can make a profit out of our weakness, they're going to do it. Now, coming here to Mexico City, what my thoughts, now I don't know whether it's politically correct or not, so it's not politically correct. Don't listen to it. Okay, so yes, expunge it, thank you, Carla, for the word. So coming here to Mexico City, well, I was thinking about the history of Mexico City and how Cortez came here. Now, you can think of that as a general equilibrium phenomenon. What was that guy trying to do? He came to Mexico to make a profit. That was it. And then, you know, by hook or by crook, and the story is by both, he managed, amazingly, to conquer Mexico. But then think about it. This is something that occurred throughout the colonial world, which was most of the world up until very recent times. So just think, you get the same message when you think about India and you think about Warren Hastings. I mean, think about Warren Hastings. The amazing thing about Warren Hastings was, first of all, that he was able to do what he did. But even more amazing was how bad it must have been. How do we know how bad it must have been? It was so bad that there was a trial which lasted years and years. And, you know, for something that he'd done, really, almost a lot, you know, something like a 1-year boat ride away from England. And then, of course, we find the same thing repeated and repeated and repeated. So it's this fishing for fools story and the power of general equilibrium. So what's supposed to be here, what we're emphasizing in this book, is you've got a fishing equilibrium. So if you have a taste for gambling, Las Vegas is going to be there. And if you live in Las Vegas, it's especially bad for you, because every time you go to the drugstore, every time you go to the supermarket, there are these opportunities. Okay, so anyway, one of the things that I learned myself from writing this book was the power of general equilibrium. And one of the things that I learned, I guess, maybe this morning when I was thinking about giving this talk, was it exactly applies to what happened here in Mexico City in this amazing event that occurred so many years ago.
Okay. Thanks, George. More questions from the floor? We have one here.
Yeah.
But I see a second hand. We can take a couple and a second hand here.
Okay.
I think you explained very well, also following your paper of the economics.
I can't hear. Just go slow.
I think you explained very well that human beings are sense seekers before being utility maximizers. But what I was wondering is the title of the economy saying why truth doesn't change our mind. Now we talk about post-truth now. It even seems that even when we are told the truth, it is more comfortable to remain into our known truth, maybe because the switching costs are too high. So I think this is an important point to, also because the sense is more comfortable. Maybe the more complex sense is not good to afford. So I think this is a further problem in what you say.
Okay.
We'll take the second question, George.
Why don't I answer them in turn?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, I think your question about why we don't believe the truth, that it seems to me that then becomes a story that's on the table. And actually, a paper that I just finished a week ago is about that. So it's about why Thomas Kuhn says that there can be all of these paradigms, there can be better paradigms which are on the table, and which can go for centuries without being adopted. So, for example, a leading example is bloodletting. So the thing is, I think again, you've indicated an area that this opens up.
I want to take 1 minute to just follow up on exactly one thing that George just said. He gave the great example of how there was a roughly 11-year trial on Warren Hastings. I wanted to say that the outcome of that trial was a new narrative. The new narrative was that the Indians were lucky to have the Brits, that the Indians were children, and that if it weren't for people like Hastings, who did kill off and on 1 billion people out of starvation, his taxes were so high, they'd be even worse off. So the challenge of the Hastings trial, after Hastings shown he had done horrible things, was to create in the Indians a story of a new subspecies.
Hi, this question is probably addressed to both of you. When there is endogenous preferences, and the question is, how do you do welfare analysis?
I didn't hear the word. When there, what type of preferences?
Endogenous preferences.
Yes, right.
How do you do welfare analysis? Suppose you expose people to some experience. As a result, their preference changes. Then when you do welfare analysis, do you use the first set of preferences or the second? In some cases, it's an easy choice. For example, if this person is a drug addict, you send him to a treatment afterwards. He's sober. Their welfare analysis is probably easier. But sometimes it's not so clear cut. For example, if you force prisoners to work, as a result, they form a good work habit. Afterwards, they become productive people. Is that how do you do welfare analysis for that? Is that a socially beneficial exercise, or is it not?
Okay, so I think I've got an answer to this. First of all, what the model in Fishing for Fools indicates is there definitely is a way to do welfare economics. The welfare economics that you want to maximize is what's good for people. Okay, so it's a very simple model. Now, the problem is that we may not like the measures that it takes to get people doing what's good for them, but that should be also part of our welfare economics. But the difficulty thing is, basically we're saying it's much more difficult to do welfare economics than people have previously thought. Why? It helps to do your welfare economics if you know that people are maximizing their true preferences of what's good for them. That's Samuelson. So that actually explains why choice theory was so powerful, why they wanted to begin the textbooks with that, because then that enabled them. But then we have to ask, was it right? And making this distinction between monkey on our shoulders case and what's good for them taste, that indicates that there's a problem with that. And the thing is, just because it's a problem and it makes our welfare economics difficult, doesn't mean we should ignore the problem. On the contrary, it means that we have to change us, not the economics.
Follow up. In your explanation, there is a clear sense what is good for this person. Sometimes it's not that clear.
I got it. Right. I know. That's
person.
Exactly it.
Right.
We make life more difficult. We make life more difficult for the economists.
Right.
But, you know, in the abstract, it may well be that there's something that is best for the person. And then that's the thing that ideally we'd want to maximize. I'm not saying that it's something that's easy to maximize. I'm not saying that you can actually know this. But it says that there is this additional problem. And the point is, the reason I went through, I called these things that we know that people could not have possibly wants, is that shows you that there are cases where it's totally unambiguous. Nobody wants to be taking Vioxx and have these heart attacks. Nobody wants to end up not being able to buy milk for your kid because you spent too much earlier. And no one wanted the financial crisis. And I think I think 80 years from now, nobody's going to want the global warming that occurred, and people are going to look back and say, what did these people do? So the fact is that so I said the onus was on us. The onus was on us. We show example after example after example where, in fact, there's these nobody could possibly want. So the fact is, I agree that there's a lot of gray area. That's all very interesting. But the fact is that there are also some stuff that doesn't even gray.
George, and maybe also for Carla, I want to use your argument to make the claim that it's actually a better scenario than you're depicting. And tell me if I'm getting this right. The fact that I have a monkey on my shoulder that likes, let us say, Cinnabons or likes to gamble means you're suggesting that there will be the Cinnabon store and the gambling store.
Yeah.
But then, aren't you denying the fact that the person who provides that store also may have a monkey on the shoulder and may not provide that store, build that store, or provide the gambling place because the monkey misleads that person? And the fact that that can happen, to me, gives a bit of hope that through narratives, you can begin to counter the same dismal scenario that is building up.
Okay. Well, we know the history. Let's go back to Mexico. Didn't happen. Didn't happen until Cortez landed. They were lucky. It just didn't happen. But the point is, you open up the markets, and then the fact that this is going to happen is going to be much more likely to happen. So the thing is, that's the power of the general equilibrium. Power of the general equilibrium is we don't need everybody in this audience who is tremendously well-meaning and honest, who would never open up a Cinnabon outlet, or who would certainly never have done any of the bad deeds we were talking about in the colonial history. And yet, all you need is a handful of people to go and do that if they see the way. Now, okay, so now I'm going to give you a slightly different answer. What we need, and this is not in our economic models, is we need all of us to be the people who actually are going to disapprove of those people and keep them from doing those bad things. And so that's why we need sanctions. So that's why, as I mentioned, the fact that we need regulation. Well, it may not be, it doesn't have to be government regulation. It can be regulation at an individual level of you just don't do that. So that's where morals come into.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I'd like to add only that implicitly, I think in George's answer, is that there really are cognitive foundations of institutions. economists have never talked about this, whereas anthropologists think it's a horrible whole. Clifford Geertz writes about how crazy it is that economists ignore this. And George's example illustrates how if we had cognitive foundations that the good life entailed not risking your family's welfare by going to Las Vegas and putting all your money on the table, then anyone who did come up with the idea of a new way of tricking you into risking your life savings would be so disapproved of. Yep. He would leave. He wouldn't do it. An example of how, without cognitive foundations, basic kinds of rules simply don't work is an example I just learned about from a forthcoming paper in a British political science journal. The British colonials, apparently in West Bengal, passed a law in the 19th century that women could inherit land when their husband died. And the Brahmins didn't like this because the Brahmins had a narrative that only men had wealth. And so they resurrected the custom of sati, which is a custom existing to this day, where the widow gets on the funeral pyre with the dead husband and is burned to death. So rather than having these women inherit land, they lost their lives entirely. You cannot work with basic laws if there's no limit on what people can do to counter. We need cognitive foundations for any kind of society. And one of the things narratives do is they provide those cognitive foundations.
So, yes.
Hi, my name is Luke Graham from UCL. So I guess one of the arguments people have had why economists haven't paid so much attention to the psychological and sociological aspects of human behavior is that we have an academic specialization of labor, where division of labor, where psychologists and sociologists, they pay attention to those aspects, and economists pay attention to incentives. And if you are a policymaker, you need to care about the psychological and the sociological aspects, and you put together a team where you have both an economist and a psychologist and a sociologist working together. So do you feel like this division of labor is working? And if you don't feel like this division of labor is working, do you then feel like we should have a sort of general social science field that people choose to enter into, so that when you are a young undergraduate student, you don't have to choose to be either an economist or a psychologist or a sociologist?
Okay, I think my answer is yes. So, yes, I feel that our responsibility is not to be economists and do what economists do. It seems to me that our responsibility is instead to take the problems that the public considers to be economic problems, or that everybody considers to be economic problems, and analyze it by whatever methods are available. And so what I see now is that that when you write a paper for, let's say, economics journals, it has to be a very stylized thing. And because of that, us economists, I think, are losing out on lots of things, lots of very, very important aspects of life. So a leading aspect of that would be the financial derivatives. We should have had our economics profession should include people who understood much better exactly how the financial markets work in detail. And then, in fact, it seemed to me that that would have been a rich area if people had known what the CDSs were doing, for example. That would have been a rich area for economists to tackle, and would have meant economics would have been better. But it's because, in fact, that the stylized way in which that papers are supposed to be written, that in fact it was all but impossible for somebody to go out and try to write that paper. And if they had written such a paper, it wouldn't have necessarily helped them in their career. So.
Okay, I think we have time. The lady behind you had a hand up.
Hello, my name is Evelyn Deitch. I'm here through UNU Wider. I was just wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit more on the role that institutions play in this spectrum, from economics on one side and, say, anthropology and psychology more on the other side. Because as somebody who's come to work in economics more from a political science, sociology background, I've always observed the sort of difference in how economists from this side deal with institutions compared to over here. And in relation to your example of the monkey, I think it's that the economists have looked at institutions in terms of regulations that prevent the monkey from acting by, for example, adopting a sugar law, a sugar tax or something like that, but not actually working with what that monkey tells you. Whereas I think sociologists are more about where does that monkey come from in the first place. So for example, if you belong to a religion where being vegan is part of that, it's that monkey that tells you not to eat the sugar. And I think that we have that sort of discrepancy between this side and that side on how they look at institutions, not quite solved yet. So I wonder how you think about that.
Okay, so let's talk about institutions. So supposing we define institutions narrowly as they would be defined in institutional economics. It seems to me that one of the things that's missing, I really love new institutional economics. I think it's really great. And so I love the multitasking model, which I think is a major contribution to economics. But the one thing that's left out of institutions is something that everybody in the other social sciences knows automatically, which is that legitimacy matters. And so that what is legitimacy? Legitimacy is a story. And it's a story which enables rules to be, if disobedience of rules to be punished. And also, having these stories, which create the legitimacy, they're what causes, in fact, transactions to be able to take place, both within the organizations and also, even if you're not within an organization, even within markets. So I think that these stories about the legitimacy of institutions is tremendously important. And I don't see that has played a sufficient role. You seldom see the word legitimacy in economics papers.
Hello. We'll take one last question. Gentleman there.
Hi. Hi, hello, thank you. So one of the nice things about economics is actually that we put the individual at the center of our analysis. So even if we do social planners analysis, we basically take the individual's preferences and aggregate them and so on and so on. And now you say that there are certain outcomes that we do not want, and I completely agree with this. So there's like obesity, or we don't want to smoke, and so on. But where do we take the authoritative argument from to say this is good for you, basically?
I don't have to answer that question. That's the point. I mean, you just answered that question in part. You mentioned the smoking, the obesity, and so forth.
Right.
It seems to me that we can look at states of the world, and some states of the world are just genuinely bad. So Carla referred to some states of the world that are just basically bad when she was talking about Bengal in particular. The thing is, maybe there are states where we just don't know. That's, right. I guess, one of the reasons that we might want a democracy, because each of us has our opinion. But the thing is, so at the very minimum, what I was giving you were examples where we didn't get Pareto optimality in terms of anybody's what's good for you. And so then there's ambiguity, and if there's ambiguity in the world, we're not going to solve it by saying that ambiguity doesn't exist. We then have to get together, maybe talk it out, maybe never talk it out, maybe reach a compromise regarding what we think. So you may think something's good, and I may think something's good. Let's have a meeting of minds on that.
Okay, so we'll take one absolute final question. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Hugo Diaz. I'd like to make a question to Dr. George. Considering North American Free Trade Agreement firmed by United States, Canada, and Mexico in the 90s, it seems governments and big companies behave like fishing for fools, just emphasizing benefits instead of cost. Right now, Mr. Trump's protectionist tried to reform the NAFTA. What do you think will be the best rationale to tackle those problems generated by the NAFTA? Since the welfare economics point of view. Thanks for your answer.
Okay. So let me not answer that question, because my wife's in politics, where I don't know whether she's in politics or not, but she's a government official. I think I'm not supposed to answer questions about the relationships between the United States and Mexico.
Please join me in thanking George again and Carla for a great session. And there's coffee outside. I'm told there's no Cinnabons outside.